Let's go! Who? Gotta do it one time for Mike Jones. Committed to LSU. What are your thoughts? Comment below. Let's go. Get on our level. Let's go, Power Hour LSU. What does this mean? Why did he even transfer from Clemson? What is the LSU linebacker depth chart going to look like? How did we even get Mike Jones? Also, there's a nasty rumor going around about Blake Baker. We will put that to rest a little bit later. So here's Mike Jones Jr. on Twitter. His announcement right here. Fully committed to LSU. And this to me is the most impressive stat. Pro Football Focus, a football grading company, had Mike Jones as the highest rated defensive back in coverage. Even though he's not a defensive back, he's by name only a linebacker. So this is absolutely insane. For the second consecutive year, Ed Orgeron has picked up the best coverage linebacker in the transfer portal. And this is great news following the Brian Thomas Jr. announcement. And by the way, you guys are still talking about it, which is great. If you want my thoughts on that, the link is down below. As far as competing this year for a national championship, Mike Jones is a guy that immediately helps you out. So let's take a look at his 247 profile. A few things I love about Mike Jones Jr. Look at that smile. 6 foot 225, but you guys, I've talked about this before. I am a big believer in kids going to IMG Academy. Elias Ricks went to IMG. I believe Grant Delpit also went to IMG. The best players go to play there, and yes, they leave their local high school to go do that, but the one thing it does is it humbles you. You're no longer the big man on campus. IMG Academy has athletes from all around the world playing all these different sports, and it's kind of like a pre-college experience. So you see a lot of kids from there turn out to be very successful college football players, and Mike Jones Jr. is no different. But let's not get carried away with Florida. How did Mike Jones even get to LSU? I believe it was the work of a new coach on campus. That coach is Austin Thomas. In fact, he's not even a coach. He is the LSU general manager. I love this Twitter handle, LSU Football GM. So I've shared before how much I like Austin Thomas. When I hear him in interviews, he talks about how much the game has changed. And yes, he has bounced around. He left LSU, went to Texas A&M, went to Baylor for a year, and now he's back. And I've gotten a lot of questions about, well, what does he actually do? Well, he does roster management, and some of that is recruiting. But to me, a lot of that now is going to be the transfer portal. But here's the thing about Mike Jones, is yes, he went to IMG Academy, but IMG is located in Bradenton, Florida. You actually got to go down here and see that he's actually from Lebanon, Tennessee. Now, his dad also former second-round pick out of North Carolina State, but still, he is from Austin Thomas's area. So, I'm just throwing it out there. I don't have this confirmed or not. I would be shocked if Austin Thomas wasn't heavily involved in getting Mike Jones to LSU. Stats from this year, and you see here 2 interceptions, one versus Ohio State, an interception in the red zone. That was one of the few defensive plays anybody made in that game. But you see here, remember, Clemson lost to Notre Dame in the middle of the season, but he didn't play. He, along with Trevor Lawrence, were on the pandemic list. And look, you saw Clemson lost that game because, well, they were stretched out in space and their best linebacker in space didn't play. No, I cover Clemson football. I do some ESPN radio in South Carolina, and the big team there is Clemson and the South Carolina Gamecocks. So I've watched a decent amount of Clemson, and I've kept up a little bit with Mike Jones. In fact, we have interacted with each other on Instagram before, and I think he saw last year that LSU brought in a coverage linebacker and basically played him wire to wire And that linebacker, Jabril Cox, is going to get drafted in the NFL. So, look, the results speak for themselves. LSU hits the portal yet again, gets another starter yet again. What does the depth actually look like at the linebacker position? So this is the roster from last year. Obviously, Jabril Cox is out of the picture now. So LSU, at this moment, has about 7 playable linebackers. The 2 most experienced are Damone Clark and Micah Baskerville. Now, Clark was the initial starter. He was given the number 18 jersey, and he was starting alongside Jabril Cox. He started to struggle, and then they inserted Micah Baskerville, who of the 2 was the better of the 2. Clark started to play better at the end of the year, had an overall good game against Florida. So those 2 are likely going to battle for that other linebacker starting spot. And I know a lot of you are like, well, we're going to be in a base 4-3. Once again, your base formation in modern college football, you're going to be in nickel more than you're going to be in base. And nickel means you have 5 defensive backs compared to just 4 defensive backs. So that means 2 linebackers more than likely are going to be on the field at all times. You would have to believe Mike Jones is better than any of the other LSU linebackers just based on simple tape study and based on his coverage skills. It is so hard as a linebacker to get that coverage experience at the high school level, and Mike Jones has it at the highest level with Clemson. He's played in a lot of big games. So he is more battle-tested in a way than Jabril Cox was coming into last year. Jabril Cox played a lot of big games, but just not at the same level as Mike Jones. So that other linebacker spot, Baskerville or Clark, likely the leaders. But what about Josh White and Antoine Sampa? All we heard last year was how much Josh White was impressing in practice. We saw him some on special teams. Antoine Sampa was once a 5-star recruit out of Virginia. You know, does either one of them battle for a starting role? What about Phillip Webb? I think some people view him more as a defensive end type of pass rusher player. So those are basically the linebackers that Mike Jones is going to have to compete against. But wait, there is more. Because remember, LSU also got into the JUCO market here with Navantique Strong. I've never been able to pronounce his name correctly. They call him Bug Strong. Out of Mississippi Gulf Coast College, he's going to be competing for some playing time. And the true freshman linebacker who's already signed on, Greg Penn III from Maryland, which, ironically, I know when you think Maryland, you don't think, football factory, but a lot of great players play in that Maryland area. There's a lot of good high school football. So Greg Penn is pretty battle-tested for a high school program. It's not a position that just rotates a lot. So we'll see what happens. LSU gets much-needed depth at that position. Now, what can Blake Baker do at this depth? He said that LSU's linebackers played with poor technique last year, so hopefully he is the answer to figuring out some of the problems LSU had at that position, because they oftentimes looked confused. They oftentimes didn't cover well. They oftentimes couldn't make simple tackles in the box. But yesterday, this nasty rumor was being spread around that Blake Baker was being considered for the defensive coordinator job at Tennessee. Reported by Jimmy Hyams. He is, the go-to guy in Tennessee. Breaks a lot of stories. So initially he reported Tennessee has offered the defensive coordinator job to Brian Baker. It's actually Blake Baker is the DC candidate at Tennessee. LSU assistant who talked to Tennessee about the job has decided to stay at LSU. Look, number one thing you can always know about Tennessee and their coaching searches, it's going to be wild. And I think what happened here was Tennessee made a mistake. They hired Josh Heupel to be their coach. Danny White is their new athletic director from UCF. He just decided to bring over his football coach. But they didn't have a defensive coordinator in mind. So they're just scrambling. And in a way, I think they knew Blake Baker wasn't going to take this job, but they just kind of floated his name out there to make it look like they're having a competent search when they're actually just scrambling. Blake Baker wasn't ever going to take this job. We've not talked about Alan Faneca at all. The LSU great who was named to the Pro Football Hall of Fame. But there was a twist this morning. So I didn't listen to the segment. This is my friend Peter Burns, LSU Hall of Famer Alan Faneca, just told us that he actually committed to Alabama the day before signing day in 1994. This is where I get some chills. This is where you'll get some chills. On the morning of signing day, he woke up and saw all the LSU posters in his room and said, "What am I doing?" and flipped to the Tigers that day. So remember in the mid-90s, LSU and Bama were not the it programs. It was far from it. So this was a lot different than, obviously, now with recruiting. But imagine Alan Faneca not going to LSU and going to Alabama. One of the great LSU offensive linemen of all time. And guess what? He deserves his just due. He deserves to get into the Hall of Fame. This is the second LSU offensive lineman to go into the Hall of Fame in the last, 5 or 6 years with Kevin Mawai getting in. So congrats to Alan Faneca, who looks nothing like he used to and is a marathon runner. How about that? So congrats to you, Mr. Faneca. I hope you enjoyed this video today. Let the Mike Jones jokes continue. Go right on ahead. Get it out of your system now, okay? It is Power Hour LSU. Boom! More slam and salmon tonight. Let's go. Salmon times 2. All that mercury. Let's go.